The subcommittee will come to order. The chair will ask all members, staff, and everyone to turn electronic devices off or on vibrate. The subcommittee is meeting today to hear testimony on the regional air carriers and pilot workforce issues. I intend to give a brief opening statement. I will call on the ranking member, Mr. Petri, to give his opening statement or remarks, and then I intend to call our first panel up, let Congresswoman Slaughter testify quickly, and then we will come back to members to give their opening statements after your testimony. We understand that Congresswoman Slaughter has a conflict and has to be out of here by 10:30, so we're going to accommodate your schedule. I welcome everyone to the Aviation Subcommittee hearing on regional air carriers and pilot workforce issues today. On February 12, 2009, a Colgan Air Bombardier -8 doing business as Continental Connection Flight 3407 crashed en route to Buffalo Niagara International Airport. All 45 passengers and the 4 crew members died, as well as 1 person on the ground. Mr. Mike Loftus' daughter, Madeline, was a passenger on Flight 3407. I am pleased he is here joining us today to offer his testimony. On behalf of each and every member of this subcommittee, I extend our sincere condolences to everyone, as well as the family members and friends who lost loved ones in this tragic accident. The National Transportation and Safety Board held a 3-day public hearing on May 12, 13, and 14 on the Colgan Air Flight Crash 347. The investigation is ongoing, and the final conclusions and outcomes are not expected to be made for many months. We need to let the NTSB investigation run its course. We will hear from the NTSB this morning. However, the NTSB hearing identified the need to closely examine the regulations governing pilot training and rest requirements and the oversight necessary to ensure their compliance, with a particular focus on regional airlines. While we do not have all the facts, I am concerned that these issues could be symptomatic of a larger trends driven by economic pressures within the airline industry. We are in an economic downturn that has placed enormous pressures on airlines to cut cost. Airlines cannot control the cost of fuel or the cost of the aircraft, but they can control what they pay their pilots, how they train their pilots, what the training will cost, and when the pilots can fly. Due to cost concerns, major airlines have cut their own domestic capacity and have outsourced air transport services, in many cases to the lowest bidder, to smaller, lower-cost regional airlines, and then they keep the passenger ticket revenue. Approximately 90% of regional airline passengers travel on flights that are scheduled, processed, marketed, ticketed, and handled by major airlines through code share arrangements. To win the contract to fly for the major carriers, the regional airlines have gone to great lengths to provide their services at the lowest possible cost. With today's economic and outsourcing business practices, pilots with decades of experiences are laid off from the major carriers, but cannot afford to work for one of the regional carriers because they are faced with starting over as a first officer making less than $25,000 a year. The economics and incentives to outsource to cheaper contractors must not outweigh the value of having experienced pilots in the cockpit. Today, regional airlines are viewed by pilots as an entry-level stepping stone. They do not pay as well as the major airlines, and they do not require as many flight hours to get hired. However, regional airlines have been involved in the last 6 fatal airline accidents, and pilot performance has been implicated in 3 of these accidents. There must be one level of safety between major and regional airlines, mandated rather than just recommended by the FAA. I believe we need to take an industry-wide look at strengthening pilot training requirements. In theory, FAA training programs certify that every airline, both regional and major, train its pilots to the same standard. I think the FAA regulations are too broad and the minimums are too low. We must find a solution to fix this so everyone is on the same level, not just in theory, but in practice. I have requested that the Inspector General for the Department of Transportation review the FAA's regulatory requirements for airline pilot training programs and report back to the subcommittee. It is important to note that many of the training issues that surfaced during last month's NTSB hearing are not new. We have seen them surface in other accidents. For example, as a result of the December 2003 Federal Express crash at Memphis involving a pilot that failed numerous proficiency checks, the NTSB recommended requiring airlines to establish remedial training programs for pilots who have demonstrated performance deficiencies. In 2006, the FAA responded by issuing guidance recommending that airlines implement remedial training programs. NTSB will testify today that despite the FAA's recommendation, Colgan did not have a remedial training program in place. While I applaud the Obama administration's call to action earlier this week, I do not believe that we can rely on airlines to voluntarily comply with industry's best practices. As we now know from testimony at the public hearings, Colgan had not fully implemented industry best practice safety initiatives, such as flight operational quality assurance programs before the accident. We need to require all regional carriers to implement the best practice safety initiatives that are common among the major carriers. Further, the major carriers need to take more ownership of the regional carriers' training programs and implementation of best practices. I also want to have a frank discussion regarding airline pilot pay. I've met with a number of pilots, a number of groups. I understand their concerns that pay and benefits have declined over the years due to bankruptcies, mergers, acquisitions, oil prices, 9/11, failed labor negotiations, and furloughs. Airline pilots are highly skilled safety professionals. They are responsible for people's lives. Airline pilots deserve the respect that their profession once had, and they should be paid far more than $25,000 a year, which is what the first officer of Flight 3407 was paid. Low pilot pay is symptomatic of other troubling pressures and trends within the industry. Some regional airlines are paying pilots the absolute minimum that the market will bear, with no relation to the lives they are responsible for or the value or seriousness of the work they perform. It is detrimental to the overall self-image and morale within the airline pilot profession, which is reflective in some instances by poor professionalism. While low pilot pay may keep airline costs down, it does not serve the public well. Moreover, low pay drives away qualified and experienced pilots. There was a time when a high percentage of our commercial pilots were former pilots in the U.S. military. That's not the case today. Far fewer military pilots, when they retire, are applying to the airlines when they retire because of the low pay of the regional carriers. The NTSB is also looking at fatigue with regard to the Colgan accident. Fatigue has been on the NTSB's most wanted list since 1990 and continues to be identified as an issue in many accidents. The FAA is yet to update its rules governing crew rest requirements, taking into consideration the latest research on fatigue. Nor has the FAA developed and used a methodology that will continually assess the effectiveness of fatigue management systems implemented by operators. This is simply unacceptable. I have asked the Inspector General to conduct an extensive review of fatigue issues, and I look forward to hearing how he intends to move forward with this audit. After this hearing, I intend to draft legislation to address some of the concerns and issues that we will discuss today. Finally, this hearing is not intended to condemn the major airlines or all regional carriers. It's intended to identify problems in the system that need to be addressed to improve and enhance safety. Before I recognize Mr. Petri for his opening statement, I ask unanimous consent to allow 2 weeks for all members to revise and extend their remarks and to permit submission of additional statements and materials by members and witnesses. Without objection, so ordered. At this time, the ranking member, Mr. Petri, is recognized.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, for having this important hearing. And in light of Representative Slaughter's time pressure, at this time, in light of the presence of our ranking minority member of the full committee, I'd ask that Mr. Micah precede me.
The ranking member, Mr. Micah, is recognized.
Well, thank you. First of all, I want to thank our chairman, Mr. Costello, for holding this meeting. Mr. Petri and I have been concerned about the performance and the accident rates of our regional commuter carriers. We have some incredible expertise on this panel. Mr. DeFazio was a distinguished ranking member. You've had the chair, have another ranking member, Mr. Ayers, and Ms. Capito. We have a great wealth of expertise on this panel. And I think that we have a responsibility to make certain that if there are deficiencies in the operation of our regional carriers, that actions are taken to correct those deficiencies. I understand, too, that Ms. Slaughter is here, and our sympathy certainly goes out to Ms. Slaughter, those from the Buffalo area, or anyone who lost loved ones in the tragic Buffalo commuter airline disaster, and to the others who have suffered similar losses. We'll hear from our FAA administrator. He's only been on the job less than 2 weeks. However, I have to express my concern that FAA as an agency has been immobilized, and for 2 years we haven't had an administrator. When I came to Congress, we had 5 administrators in about 6 years. We put in place a mechanism to change that. It's difficult enough when you have an agency with an administrator, let alone an agency that's so important and critical to safety, and not have a confirmed administrator in place. So I can't criticize in any way Mr. Babbitt. He's only been on the job 2 weeks, and these problems have festered the last several years. There's something wrong when we have planes, commuter planes, falling out of the sky. There's something wrong when we have repeated accidents. The chairman just spoke. We've had 6 very serious and loss of life, fatal commuter crashes. The potential factors outlined as to the reasons why we had those crashes all dealt with pilot performance. Well, I won't say all of them. I say at least 4 of the 6. Now, we instituted, when I became chairman, a risk-based system. And certainly that risk-based system would be geared to looking at where we've had problems. And if we have commuter airline crashes and we have pilot performance as a key issue and creating some of the factors that led to those crashes, the system there's something wrong in not addressing those deficiencies. It's my understanding that and let me go back to I think Peter was involved in this, our FAA reauthorization the last time. I think that Mr. DeFazio will recall that we saw NTSB come forward with recommendations that were not instituted. They would make a recommendation and then it would just sort of fall off the cliff, or it would stay on the shelf. Now, we put into law a mechanism that required that those recommendations be reported back to Congress that were not addressed. And I found out yesterday that the DOT and FAA were to have had in February to Congress their recommendations on deficiencies in aviation, and we still don't have those before Congress. Now, there's something wrong with what we passed, and we need to make certain that those recommendations do come to Congress, and that either FAA, DOT, or the administration, someone acts on those. And when you have repeated fatal crashes, and we have a risk-based system, we have a requirement for reporting those incidents, and nothing is done, there's something wrong. So, Mr. Chairman, you just said that we will pass legislation, and I'll join you. Let me say in closing also, The FAA, and I think the chairman of NTSB has said he has recommended that we open up the performance records of pilots beyond 5 years. Now, it's limited to 5 years, and then a pilot has to give a waiver, and I understand the regionals often don't even ask for that. But those records must be open on their performance, and I think also on their training and their certification to be behind the yoke of an aircraft or in the pilot or co-pilot seat, so that we know that people with qualifications and training are there. We know that where we've identified deficiencies in a pilot's ability to perform or to be certified, that is known. So I will join you, our side of the aisle, Mr. Petri, I know will join you. If we have to take corrective action by legislation, we will put in place whatever measures. If we have to go back, Mr. DeFazio, and change what we put into law to require that those recommendations by NTSB are not just left on the shelf. And I was stunned that FAA and DOT still have not gotten what should have been in February before us to us, and this is June. So again, in a spirit of cooperation, a spirit that we need to stop this carnage in the air, I look forward to working with you and pledge our support. Thank you. Yield back.
I thank the ranking member for his comments, and we'll make two comments concerning points that you made. The last reauthorization, I don't necessarily think we need to change the law. I think we know what the problem is. It's within the FAA, and we need to address that, and we hope that the new administrator will, in fact, address the issue. I understand, and when he testifies, we will have an opportunity to talk to him about what he intends to implement as far as tracking NTSB recommendations at the FAA and reporting to Congress. Secondly, we do intend to work in a bipartisan manner to address a number of issues that need to go into legislation. We have a number of recommendations by the NTSB. We have other recommendations that have made by the FAA to the airline industry that have not been complied with. As opposed to making recommendations, we need to put some of these things into law so that they are mandatory and not discretionary. So with that, I would recognize and ask Congresswoman Slaughter to please come to the table, and we'll be joined by Congressman Christopher John Lee as well. At this time, the chair will recognize the first panel, hear from Congresswoman Slaughter and Congressman Christopher John Lee, and then after their testimony, we will go back to opening statements by any member who wants to make an opening statement. At this time, the chair recognizes the chairwoman of the Rules Committee in the House, the distinguished gentlelady from the 28th District of New York, the Honorable Louise Slaughter.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman, and I thank you for your gracious invitation to be here this morning. I did hear so much in both opening statements that made me feel quite elated, if we can use that word in such a sad day. It is a very important hearing that you're having today, and some of the family members from the Buffalo crash are here, and among them is a woman named Beverly Eckert, whom we all learned to know and to love, because Beverly lost her husband in 9/11 and was one of the family members working there, and now is devoting herself to airline safety. She and her sister Susan are here. They lost a sister on that crash. This committee is very special to me. It was the first committee I sat on. I sat where Ms. Capito is, and Peter DeFazio and I were elected the same day, and he's very special to me all by himself. Peter and I have a caucus. You may not be surprised to learn it's called the Cantankerous Caucus. There are only 2 of us on it. As we are all acutely aware, one of the worst plane accidents in the recent U.S. history occurred earlier this year on the night of February 12th, just outside of Buffalo, New York. We lost so many lives that night, and we continue to pray and to think often of the people whose grief and loss are immeasurable. And we have to learn from this tragedy in order to prevent the future loss of life. Now, beginning on May 12th, the NTSB conducted 3 days of hearings on Colgan Air Flight 3407, and we were shocked and saddened by what we learned about regional carriers. There are still many unanswered questions and lots of work to be done to ensure the safety of passengers and crew when traveling on regional airlines, and as members of Congress, it is our responsibility and our mission. Much of what we have learned about regional airline industry training and standards is shocking, and we want to immediately attack that, and I'm so pleased to hear this morning that that will be done. The regional airlines training programs are clearly inadequate. It is unacceptable for flight academies, such as Florida-based Gulfstream Academy, to advertise that they can train amateur pilots who have aspirations to fly for a major carrier in only 3 months for as much as $30,000 in tuition. Passengers deserve only the best trained pilots, and I commend Secretary LaHood and Administrator Babbitt for recently ordering the FAA inspectors to ensure that regional carrier training programs are complying with the federal regulations. And we must demand that all pilots receive extensive and thorough training, as well as enforce the high standards for the regional carrier industry. I think enforce is the operative word here. I was amazed to learn how little pilots are paid upon graduating from flight academies. The first officer was paid $16,000 a year. If that isn't a minimum wage job, I really don't know what is. In addition to that, we had to pay her own way back and forth to work. I have learned, and I believe this is so, that if she was not flying at a time, her wages did not take place at all. She was not paid for anything except flight time. Any time to and from work was not considered. There's a joke that goes around among some of the pilots. It says, what do you call a regional first officer without a girlfriend? And the answer is homeless. Now, that's not funny when regional carriers account for half of the country's scheduled airline trips. Thousands of lives are at stake daily, and these pilots must be compensated properly to ensure that we attract the people who can fly the planes adequately. And this leads me to the issue of fatigue, which you've spoken of. Certainly a major factor in Buffalo's tragedy, because both pilots had had no rest. They were not paid sufficiently money to be able to get a hotel room or stay overnight to sleep, and slept sometimes in their cars. Or in the pilot's lounge, where I understand it's perfectly illegal, but they do it nonetheless. Now, it's no wonder that they were found sleeping in the crew lounges, but we must demand compliance with the orders that we have for sufficient rest in order to remain alert and react properly. I am one of the thousands of people who believe that that was complied with. I just assumed that it was. And I was stunned to learn that the pilot of Flight 3407 had failed 5 tests, including 2 with Colgan. Even more disturbing is that the airline was not aware of the 3 other failures, and Mr. Micah referred to that, something we absolutely cannot allow. We must have more transparency. It is unacceptable. We have to provide the airlines access to the pilot's entire flying history, and it should be made readily available on the Internet. Passengers shouldn't have to guess whether their pilot is competent and rested and even well, because I understand that in some cases they don't get to take off a day if they are ill. They fly or no pay. Like many of my colleagues, I fly weekly on regional airlines. I purchased my ticket from U.S. Air, but the plane is operated and maintained by Wisconsin Air. The information is not provided at the point of purchase, let alone prior to boarding the plane, and I'm sure that 90% of the persons believe they are flying U.S. Air. We have to require airlines to disclose to consumers the operator of the flight prior to purchasing their ticket so that they have the opportunity to make well-informed choices. Most recently, an FAA investigation accused Florida-based Gulfstream Airlines of overworking their pilots and breaking airline maintenance rules. And former pilots for Gulfstream report seeing pieces fall from their airplanes and say that records were routinely changed or even erased. They had even complained they had installed on those planes unapproved air conditioner compressors. These types of practices must come to an end, and regional airlines must be held accountable for negligence. I think we've only scratched the surface of anything goes, and safety can sometimes be second to profit. We must address these critical issues to ensure our safety when boarding a regional airline. It's our responsibility and duty to help restore the public's faith through the introducing strong and meaningful legislation, which has to require compliance with standards and an FAA that can assure us that they are able to certify those standards are being met. There are many charges of a too cozy relationship between airline owners and the FAA. And I would like to mention, too, that I'd like to see a little more teeth in what the NTSB does with their painstaking work and the recommendations. Now, I understand they're only recommendations. They may or may not be followed. I would like to see a little bit of work done on that as well. I know they do not want to be regulators, nor do we want them to be. But the suggestions that they make after the kind of work they do should be given a priority. Lives depend on it. Thank you all, members of this committee, for allowing me to come today. And I look forward to working with you with some legislation that can make us all feel safer and bring to some fruition the dream of the families and parents of the children who died on that airplane, that it won't be happening again. Thank you very much.
Chair thanks you, and we'll say that we will work closely with you. We've had a meeting earlier in the week, and last week we discussed a number of issues. Your interest in bringing forth legislation, we intend to work closely with you, and we thank you for your testimony. I
feel a great deal of comfort with your expertise and your knowledge of this and your intent in seeing this through. I thank you very much for that.
Thank you.
Mr. Costello.
Chair now recognizes the gentleman from the 26th District of New York, the Honorable Christopher John Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I'm pleased actually being a resident of Clarence, New York, and being directly affected. And actually where the plane went down was roughly 3 miles from where I raised my family, so this obviously has a lot of meaning to me. And directly knowing 3 individuals who were on that flight of 49. So again, I'm grateful to have the opportunity to speak here today on an issue that is not only important to my constituents, but all constituents throughout the United States. As major airlines have confronted significant challenges in maintaining market share, regional airlines have continued to expand their operations and now, as we know, account for roughly half of the nation's commercial flights. That includes Continental Connection Flight 3407, which departed Newark, New Jersey on the night of February 12, 2009, carrying 49 passengers and crew en route to Buffalo, New York. One of those passengers was a 24-year-old woman by the name of Madeline Loftus. Madeline was returning to Buffalo that night to play in an alumni hockey game at Buffalo State College. And though she had purchased a Continental ticket, she was actually flying on a plane operated by Colgan Air with a crew hired and trained by Colgan. Madeline died that evening when Flight 3407 crashed in Clarence Center, New York, just 5 miles from the Buffalo Niagara Airport. All 49 passengers on board and 1 resident on the ground were lost. Today, this panel will hear from Madeline Loftus's father, Mike, who served for more than 20 years as a pilot on Continental Airlines. Mr. Loftus wants nothing less than to ensure that a tragedy like this never occurs again, and I thank the committee for allowing him to appear before you today on behalf of the family members of victims 3407. I've also had an opportunity to meet many of the families, and the part that has astounded me is how resolute they are on having something positive come out of this horrible tragedy, and I commend all of them. As you know, the need for further congressional scrutiny of this accident became rapidly apparent when recent NTSB hearings revealed a number of troubling findings, including the crew's lack of hands-on training and experience in the plane safety systems. For instance, the crew was trained in the activation of the stick shaker, but not in the next step, activation of the stick pusher. questionable handling of failed check rides by Colgan Air. Specifically, despite the fact that the pilot of Flight 3407 had failed 2 general aviation check ride failures, we now know that Colgan did not attempt to access this information. And I, for one, believe the FAA should have made this a mandatory requirement, not a voluntary requirement. And non-essential cockpit conversation below 10,000 feet is in violation of FAA sterile cockpit rule. These revelations have left the families to struggle with the harsh reality that this horrific tragedy may have been preventable, and far more questions than answers about how all the regional carriers operate. For my part, I am concerned that a culture of cost-cutting has pervaded the regional air carriers, leaving passengers at risk. That is why I've joined with my colleagues from Western New York to push for an independent, comprehensive review of all commercial pilot training and certification programs. The Government Accountability Office study would look at every aspect of these programs, including required training hours, training practices for new technologies, and the adequacy of responses to unsatisfactory check rides. Additionally, we are interested in learning what information is required to be provided by pilots on their job applications and what ability air carriers now have to verify that data. And while we are pleased that the House has given a go-ahead for this analysis in the form of an amendment to the recently approved FAA reauthorization legislation, it is clear that we should not wait any longer to proceed. I am submitting into the record today a letter Congresswoman Slaughter, Congressman Higgins, and I have written to the GAO instructing them to begin their work at once. I urge this panel to lend its support to this bipartisan effort so we can expose information that will inform future steps taken by Congress to improve pilot training practices and ensure passenger safety and confidence. I also urge this panel to hold the FAA accountable and demand that it does its part to strengthen oversight of the regional air carriers and implement the NTSB's most wanted safety recommendations on flying in icy conditions. Finally, like many Western New Yorkers, as I mentioned, I knew several people who lost their lives on Flight 3407, including a personal friend of mine, an expectant mother whose child would have been just 2 or 3 weeks old at this point in her life. I just want to say that I am very proud of the first responders, the volunteers, and all members of my community for coming together to provide support to those who have been affected by this horrible tragedy. Again, I'm grateful for the committee's time here today, and I hope this hearing is just the beginning of a prolonged effort to ensure justice is brought forward and increase safety for our families. So, thank you.
The Chair thanks you for your testimony, and we look forward to working with you on legislation. The Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. DeFazio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for convening this important hearing, and hopefully we will get results and changes this time. The scheduling of this hearing caused me to go back and review some of my history with this issue, starting in a 1992 hearing on these issues of crew training and fatigue. And Mr. Babbitt actually testified during that hearing, and I'll be following up on some of the issues he raised at that time now that he's in charge, and hopefully can fix the problems that he identified at that time, which I believe led directly to the crash of this plane and the deaths of many innocent people. We need to set some standards here. We've got to stop the race to the bottom. We have an industry that's in economic distress, and we have a race to the bottom. We've been talking about this for a very long time, and it's time for action. I just find it extraordinary, Mr. Chairman, that the FAA has set such a low bar for minimum standards, 250 hours for a first officer. Now, of course, it's up to the airline to determine how many more hours they would require for initial hire, and it's also, unfortunately, up to the airline to determine what kind of training they will provide to that person once they're hired, although the FAA does oversee or confirm the training that the airline would provide. None of that is right. We need to set a much, much higher minimum bar, and that'll get to the root of a lot of these problems. You know, this is a fairly serious undertaking, flying an airplane, particularly in difficult conditions. We would think that it would be perhaps looked at as seriously as training for a nail technician. In the state of Oregon, you have to have 600 hours of training to be a nail technician. You have to have 1,350 hours to be a barber, but you can't use chemicals. And then when you get to the point of being able to color people's hair, it requires 1,700 hours of training. But the FAA has set the bar at 250, and they leave it up to these regional airlines to determine how many more hours they might require for an initial hire. That has to change. And if we set the bar a good deal higher, then, of course, probably compensation will follow. If compensation follows, we won't find young women living with their parents in Seattle, red-eyeing across the country and sleeping in the crew room and then trying to fly a plane in conditions that she did not have adequate experience to deal with. This has got to stop. It has to stop, and this hearing has to be the beginning of that change at last. We will hear from the NTSB. The issue of crew fatigue has been on their most wanted list for 19 years. The FAA proposed a rule in 1995. We don't have it yet. Why? I'm told, well, there was big disagreement between the pilots and the airlines. And we'll hear from the Regional Airline Association, where they'll say, well, no pilot would ever fly fatigued. All they have to do is call in and say it. But Mr. Babbitt testified in 1992, well, no, in fact, there's intimidation, harassment, and firing if you call in fatigued. Now, if they can't agree on a rule, it might be because the pilots think that the current rules cause people to fly fatigued, and the airlines say, well, this would cost us money. So if we want to follow the rule that the airlines say they follow, which is, well, it's always up to the pilot, well, then the airline should have conceded to the pilots, we should have adopted a fatigue rule, and we shouldn't be sitting here today with this hearing. But we are. So, Mr. Chairman, I hope that this is a new beginning with a new administration, a new administrator, and a very assertive new chairman, that we finally get these things done. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The Chair thanks you, Mr. DeFazio, and now recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Petri.
Thank you again for holding this hearing, Mr. Chairman, and I just need to emphasize that our committee's highest priority is aviation safety. And that comes before everything else. And that is what we're attempting to, that emphasis is what we're attempting to underline by having this hearing and to actually do what we can to improve safety. It's only fair to say that the American aviation industry is, in fact, and especially the large commercial aviation industry, is about the safest in the world. But that is no reason for relaxing, and it's no reason for not reviewing and improving procedures everywhere that we can. And I know we're committed to that goal. According to the Department of Transportation Office of Inspector General, since 2003, there have been 6 fatal commercial passenger accidents, and all have involved regional carriers. So it's imperative that we fully explore the issues related to the safety of regional carriers as we are doing in this hearing. 4 of those, has been pointed out, were evidently, at least in part, pilot performance as a potential factor in the fatal accident. The National Transportation Safety Board has made recommendations on icy conditions, runway safety, and recording devices. And in light of their recommendations, I look forward to hearing from today's witnesses. It's important that we hear from those who are directly involved, and that witnesses have the opportunity to share their expertise and insights on how to address this important but complicated aviation safety issue. A number of my constituents have contacted me, and I will be asking some questions that they have suggested as well, because this is something that affects, obviously, the traveling public and all of us as citizens. With that, I will put my full statement in the record. I just want to thank Mr. Loftus, in particular, who's here testifying on behalf of the families of Continental Flight 3407. I know that your and other members' insights will be important to this committee, and we appreciate the effort you've put into being here today. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Chair, thanks, the ranking member. I would remind members that we have 11 witnesses scheduled to testify. We have our first panel of 2 witnesses. Members have gone, our members panel, but now we have a government panel. So I would encourage members, strongly encourage members, if they would, to submit their statements for the record. If, in fact, someone wants to make an opening statement, feel strongly about it, I will recognize you, but I would strongly encourage you to put statements in the record so that we can get to our witnesses and have ample opportunity for all of you to be able to ask them questions. With that, the chair now will go to our panel of witnesses before us. The chair now recognizes Ms. Smith, who wants to be recognized.
And Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I will be brief. I want to thank you for holding this hearing. I want to thank our ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Micah, and our ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Petrie, for this important hearing. So much has been said about Continental Flight 3407. It is a tragic and heartbreaking accident. And I think it's important that we do not prejudge what the NTSB is going to say when it completes its investigation, but regardless of the conclusions it winds up drawing, Congress and the airline industry should take a hard look at regional carriers. And based what we have learned so far, we really need to review pilot experience, fatigue, training, and the safety standards. I also think it's fair to recognize that air travel is the safest it has ever been, and still I'm sure my colleagues in the industry would agree that one preventable accident is just too many. And so if we can take some reasonable measures and precautions to make air travel even safer, it's not that we should, we absolutely must. I look forward to hearing from everyone, but most importantly, Mr. Loftus, who lost his wonderful 24-year-old daughter, Madeline. Because you see, I was touched in my own district. I represent 2 wonderful people, Robert and Denise Perry of Loveland, Ohio, whose 27-year-old son, Jonathan, was among the passengers, and he was their love and their life, and that mother goes to bed every night with empty arms simply because pilots made a mistake. I continue to be awed by the strength and the perseverance of folks like Robert and Denise and their hope when they came to me and said, make something positive come from this. It is our duty to do that. And so I want to thank you, Chairman Costello, for giving us this opportunity to make something positive out of this, and I look forward to this important hearing.
Chair, thanks, gentlelady, and now we'll introduce our panel of witnesses before us, the Honorable Mark Rosenker, who is the acting chairman of the National Transportation and Safety Board. He is accompanied by Mr. Tom Haueter, who is the director, Office of Aviation Safety with the NTSB. Mr. Randy Babbitt, who is the newly, as you heard, FAA administrator. Mr. Calvin Scovel III, who is the Inspector General with the U.S. Department of Transportation. As all of you know, gentlemen, you have testified before the subcommittee before. We would make you aware that your entire statement will appear in the record. We would ask you to summarize your statement, and the chair now recognizes the Honorable Mr. Rosenker.
Morning, Chairman Costello, Ranking Member Petrie, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. I'd like to begin my testimony with a short summary of the NTSB's investigative actions to date regarding the accident involving Colgan Air Flight 3407. I want to emphasize this is still an ongoing investigation, and that there is significant work left for our investigators. My testimony today will therefore be limited to those facts that we have identified to date, and I will steer clear of any analysis of what we have found so far and avoid any ultimate conclusions that might be drawn from that information. On February 12, 2009, at about 10:17 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, Colgan Air Flight 3407, a Bombardier-8Q400, crashed during an instrument approach to runway 23 at Buffalo Niagara International Airport in Buffalo, New York. The flight was operating as a Part 121 scheduled passenger flight from Liberty International Airport, Newark, New Jersey. The 4 crew members and 45 passengers were killed, and the aircraft was destroyed by impact forces and post-crash fire. 1 person in a house was also killed, and 2 individuals escaped with the house with minor injuries. On May 12, 2009, the NTSB commenced a 3-day public hearing on the accident, in which we explored airplane performance, cold weather operations, sterile cockpit compliance, flight crew training and performance, and fatigue management. I'd like to note that all of these issues are pertinent to every airline operation, major air carriers as well as regional air carriers. Our investigation continues, and every day we make progress. Now I'd like to discuss some of the board's important safety recommendations. The NTSB has issued numerous recommendations to the FAA on stall training, stick pusher training, pilot records, remedial training for pilots, sterile cockpit, situational awareness, pilot monitoring skills, low airspeed alerting systems, pilot professionalism and fatigue, and aircraft icing. 2 of these issue areas, aircraft icing and human fatigue, are on the board's most wanted list. While there are currently more than 450 open recommendations to the FAA, on January 12th, the agency took action on some of those actions when they published an NPRM addressing pilot training and qualifications. The notice also proposes to amend issues including the requirement of flight training simulators in traditional flight crew member training programs and adding training requirements in safety-critical areas. The NPRM addresses issues raised in numerous safety recommendations that the NTSB have issued to the FAA. In 1995, the NTSB issued recommendations to the FAA to require an airline to evaluate an applicant pilot's experience, skills, and abilities before hiring the individual. The following year, Congress enacted the Pilot Records Improvement Act, PREA. PREA required any company hiring a pilot for air transportation request and receive records from any organization that had previously employed the pilot during the previous 5 years. However, PREA does not require an airline to obtain FAA records of failed flight checks. The board has recognized that additional data contained in FAA records, including records of flight check failures and rechecks, would be beneficial for a potential employer to review and evaluate. Therefore, in 2005, the NTSB issued another recommendation to the FAA to require airlines, when considering an applicant for a pilot position, to perform a complete review of the FAA airman records, including any notices of disapproval for flight checks. In response to the NTSB's recommendation, the FAA stated that notices of disapproval for flight checks for certificates and ratings are not among the records explicitly required by PREA, and therefore to mandate that air carriers obtain such notices would require rulemaking or a change in PREA itself. To the credit of the FAA, on November 7, 2007, an advisory circular was issued informing carriers that they can ask pilots to sign a consent form giving the carrier access to any notices of disapproval. The recommendation is currently classified open, acceptable, alternative response. However, to date, the FAA has not taken rulemaking action or asked Congress to modify the Act. Mr. Chairman, this concludes my testimony, and I will be glad to answer any questions.
The chair thanks you, Mr. Rosenker, and now recognizes the FAA Administrator, Mr. Babbitt.
Well, thank you, Chairman Costello, Ranking Member Petri, and the distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me here today to discuss regional air carriers and pilot workforce issues. Let me begin by saying that we at the FAA deeply mourn the tragic loss of Colgan Air Flight 3407. This is an agency that's dedicated to aviation safety, and any loss that we incur is felt keenly by all of us. Likewise, our sympathies also go out to the families and the loved ones of the passengers and crew of Air France flight number 447. This is my first, my first appearance at a hearing before this subcommittee since I was sworn in as the FAA Administrator, and I want to advise you that I certainly look forward to working with you, Mr. Chairman, and the entire subcommittee as we move forward. We have a very ambitious agenda ahead of us at the FAA, and I intend to work very hard to achieve those safety goals. Since the mid-1990s, there has been a requirement for one level of safety, that all regional carriers must operate under the same rules and at the same level of safety as the major airlines, their counterparts. And I'm proud to say that when I was president of the Airline Pilots Association, I led the efforts in coordination with the FAA to break those changes. All air carriers that operate today with 10 or more seats are required to operate and meet at the same level of safety standards and the same level of safety oversight across the board. When the NTSB conducted its public hearing last month on the Colgan air crash, several issues came to light regarding pilot training and their qualifications, pilot crew fatigue, and the consistency of safety standards and compliance between air transportation operators. Given that the NTSB has not yet concluded its investigation, I cannot speak at this point on the potential findings. My written testimony does provide details which I will submit as to the current requirements with regard to pilot training, pilot records, and flight time and duty time limitations. But I can tell you that on Tuesday, Secretary LaHood and I announced that we have ordered FAA inspectors to focus their inspections on training programs in order to better ensure that all airlines, including regional airlines, are complying with federal regulations. We're also taking the step of gathering representatives from the major air carriers, their regional partners, aviation industry groups, and labor here in Washington, D.C. on June 15th to participate in what we're calling a call to action. And this is the sole focus will be to improve airline safety and pilot training. This review will address those issues, pilot training, cockpit discipline, and other issues that are associated with flight safety. And while we await the findings of the NTSB's investigation in the Colgan air crash, the Secretary and I believe that there is no time to lose upon acting the information that we already have and is available to us. So on June 15th, our summit is designed to foster actions, immediate actions, that involuntary commitments that we'll get from the carriers, and they're going to focus on 4 key areas. First, air carrier management responsibilities for crew education and support. Second, professional standards and flight discipline. Third, training standards and performance. And fourth, mentoring relationships that exist or should exist between mainline carriers and their regional partners. The Colgan Air accident and the loss of Air France 447 remind us that we can never rest on our laurels of our safety record, and that we must remain alert and vigilant and aware of the challenges that are in our aviation system. We've got to continue to work to enhance the safety of this system. This is a business where one mistake is one mistake too many. So Chairman Costello, Ranking Member Petri, members of this subcommittee, this concludes my prepared remarks. I'd be happy to answer any questions.
The Chair thanks you for your testimony and now recognizes the Inspector General for the Department of Transportation, General Scovel.
Chairman Costello, Ranking Member Petri, members of the subcommittee, we appreciate the opportunity to testify today regarding regional air carriers and pilot workforce issues. Safety is a shared responsibility among FAA, manufacturers, airlines, and airports. Together, all 4 form a series of overlapping controls to keep the system safe. The past several years have been one of the safest periods in history for the aviation industry. However, the tragic accident in February of Colgan Flight 3407 underscores the need for constant vigilance over aviation safety on the part of all stakeholders. Last month, NTSB held a preliminary hearing into the cause of the Colgan accident, in which some evidence suggested that pilot training and fatigue may have contributed to the crash. As a result, Mr. Chairman, you requested that our office begin an extensive review into some of the issues that were brought to light during that NTSB hearing. We have already begun work on this review. Today, I would like to discuss some of the operational differences between mainline and regional air carriers, and then move on to weaknesses in FAA's oversight of the aviation industry. First, it's important to note that regional flights represent 1/2 of the total scheduled flights in this country, and regional airlines provide the only scheduled airline service to over 400 American communities. Therefore, it's critical that there truly be one level of safety for all carriers. Our preliminary audit work has identified differences in regional and mainline carrier operations and potential differences in pilot training programs and level of flight experience. For example, regional carriers typically perform short and medium hauls to hub airports. This could result in many short flights on the same day for a pilot with a regional carrier. Multiple studies by agencies such as NASA have concluded that these types of operations can contribute to pilot fatigue, but FAA has yet to revise its rules governing crew rest requirements. As for FAA's role in determining whether both mainline and regional air carriers have developed programs to ensure that pilots are adequately trained and have sufficient expertise to perform their responsibility, we find these issues to be particularly acute for regional carriers. As you know, the last 6 fatal accidents involved regional carriers, where NTSB cited pilot performance as a potential contributory factor in 4 of those 6 accidents. Moving to my second point, weaknesses in FAA's oversight of the aviation industry. Our past work has shown serious lapses in FAA's safety oversight and inconsistencies in how many of its rules and regulations are enforced. The hearing in April 2008 before the full committee highlighted such weaknesses in FAA's risk-based oversight system known as ATOS and air carrier compliance with safety directives. While our work identified safety lapses in Southwest Airlines compliance, many stakeholders were concerned that they could be symptomatic of much deeper problems with FAA's air carrier oversight on a system-wide level. In 2002, we had reported that FAA needed to develop national oversight processes to ensure that ATOS is effectively and consistently implemented. Then in 2005, we found that inspectors did not complete 26% of planned ATOS inspections. Last year, we reported that weaknesses in FAA's implementation of ATOS allowed compliance issues in Southwest's maintenance program to go undetected for several years. Our most recent and still ongoing work has determined that lapses in oversight inspections were not limited to Southwest. FAA oversight offices for 7 other major air carriers also missed ATOS inspections. Some had been allowed to lapse well beyond the 5-year inspection cycle. Additionally, FAA's national oversight of other facets of the industry, such as repair stations, has struggled to keep pace with the dynamic changes occurring in those industries. These facilities are rapidly becoming air carriers' primary source for aircraft maintenance. We have found that FAA relies heavily on air carriers to provide oversight of those repair stations. However, that oversight has not always been effective. In 2008, we reported that air carriers did not identify all deficiencies at repair stations and did not adequately follow up on deficiencies identified to ensure that problems were corrected. This is a particular concern for regional carriers who rely heavily on repair stations. According to data provided to the Department, regional carriers send as much as half their maintenance to repair stations. NTSB's investigation into the crash of another regional carrier, Air Midwest Flight 5481, in January 2003, identified serious lapses in the carrier's oversight of outsourced maintenance. Let me conclude, Mr. Chairman, by reiterating that we will continue to do our part in advancing the Department's goal of one level of safety. While all stakeholders are committed to getting it right, including FAA, who has made progress in improving aspects of its safety oversight, our work continues to identify significant vulnerabilities that must be addressed. This will require actions in areas FAA has already targeted for improvement, as well as other areas where FAA will need to revisit differences in standards and regulations and rethink its approach to safety oversight. That concludes my statement. Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to address any questions you or other members of the subcommittee might have.
Thank you, Mr. Scovel. And as I mentioned earlier that I had a meeting with Administrator Babbitt on some of these issues, I also had a meeting earlier this week with Mr. Scovel. The chair now recognizes the distinguished chairman of the full committee, Chairman Oberstar.
Thank you for holding this hearing, Mr. Chairman, and your continuing vigilance over aviation safety and the tight rein you're holding on the government and accountability on government agencies and on the airlines themselves. As I've said many, many times, safety begins in the corporate boardroom. We need a corporate culture of safety permeating the industry And where that lapses, then the FAA, the National Transportation Safety Board, the Inspector General, and our committee and our counterpart committee and the other body must maintain vigilance. And we have done that. We had a hearing on regional safety when I chaired this subcommittee 15, 17, 18 years ago. I think you testified at that hearing, Captain Babbitt. And the NTSB has time and again issued recommendations and directives, not directives, but recommendations for action, and those need to be implemented. And we need the Transportation Safety Board's continued vigilance. You mentioned, as I was walking in, Administrator Captain Babbitt, flight deck management and procedures. And I hope that's a matter we can explore further in the course of this hearing, but it's one that you need to review. Again, I hope that in this meeting you've called, that there will be a renewed interest in pairing in the flight deck of the pilot and the first officer, matching experience levels, revisiting the experience levels of those who serve in the flight deck and regional airline operations, assuring that there is compatibility and comparability of service. All too often, we've seen in the past and the tragedy that occurred at Hibbing in my district. We had a relatively senior captain and a very junior first officer who was intimidated by his captain and reluctant to speak up and say, are you, as we know from the voice recorder, didn't say anything about we're going through a fast rate of descent. You need to have that ability of that flight deck crew to talk with each other, for one who sees something that's not quite appropriate, to speak up and feel the freedom to speak up and understand that he or she has the responsibility to speak up. And I see Chairman Rosenker nodding in agreement, and I appreciate that. In the 1990s, the department and the FAA concurred, and the industry, on a one level of safety. You can't have one for Part 121 carriers, Part 135 carriers, and for the air taxi services and for the rest. We need one level of safety. You can begin your tenure as administrator by ensuring that one level of safety is revived, alive and well, invigorated, and enforced. And that's what we're looking to you to do. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The chair thanks you, Mr. Oberstar. Let me, Mr. Scovel, you indicated in your testimony, you heard me mention in my opening statement that in theory we have this one level of safety for both the majors and the regionals, but in practice it does not exist. And is that what I heard you say when you testified?
That's correct, Mr. Chairman.
And what is your recommendation that what should be done in order to take it from theory to practice to make certain that we in fact do have one level of safety for the majors as well as the regionals?
Mr. Chairman, the phrase one level of safety to me expresses FAA's and the Congress's, the Department's goal, its aspiration for one standard of safety, but clearly the record tells us that we haven't reached it yet. One level implies level, it implies attainment or achievement, but we're not there yet. In order for FAA to get there, it needs to pay greater attention, more consistent attention to its safety oversight programs. As our reports to FAA and to this body have indicated, for instance, with the ATOS program, and we testified last year in the Southwest hearings, and we're about to issue another report on ATOS, while the risk-based oversight approach to safety is highly recommended, and we commend FAA for undertaking that effort, its implementation has been problematic. Our report that will be forthcoming will show that in addition to Southwest, 7 other major carriers have had problems completing their required safety attribute inspections on a 5-year cycle as required by ATOS regulations. Regionals were recently brought into the ATOS program. Our discussions with FAA inspectors responsible for implementing ATOS at the regionals show that they are struggling with it. It seems to them that ATOS has been designed to foster safety or to account for safety programs in the majors, but seems to have less applicability to them in the regionals. ASAP, sir, a voluntary disclosure reporting program made available for aviation industry employees so that they can report safety problems without fear of administrative or disciplinary action by their employers or FAA. Majors report that and we released a report on ASAP in May, sir. The majors have told us that that is a key safety element for them of their safety effort. We reported that FAA, it's a missed opportunity for FAA. They're not accumulating and analyzing the data from ASAP themselves, but applying it to regionals. We have found that 37% of the larger regional carriers do not participate in ASAP. If it's a valuable program for the majors, we think it might also be a valuable program for the regionals. We understand it's a voluntary program for carriers, but perhaps with greater FAA attention and accommodation, more regionals might be persuaded to join. Risk-based oversight, sir. With regard to repair stations, we've testified repeatedly in this committee and also over in the Senate that FAA's implementation of its new risk-based oversight system when it comes to outsourced maintenance is and remains ineffective. In order to have risk-based oversight, you need to know where the risk is so that you can target your scarce inspector resources. In order to do that, you have to acquire data. FAA has been unable to date to devise a mechanism that will induce the carriers to provide data on what maintenance has been conducted, how much, and where it has been so that FAA can follow up. In addition, sir, and in closing, I'd commend FAA to look carefully to the outstanding NTSB recommendations, all of which will provide a further roadmap in order to achieve the goal of one level of safety.
Thank you. Administrator Babbitt, I was pleased when the President selected an administrator who was a commercial pilot, who has testified before this subcommittee, who has worked with the Congress on many issues in the past, who has knowledge of many of the issues that we're trying to address here in this hearing. However, you are taking over an agency that has a history of becoming more of a bureaucracy than an agency that performs well and responds well to demands of the Congress and the public, so you have a big job ahead of you. I know that Secretary LaHood and you announced this initiative and that you will be meeting with the regionals and I assume the majors as well. Tell us about what you hope to accomplish and tell us how you intend to move forward after the meeting.
Yes, sir. Mr. Chairman, the purpose here, and let me echo a statement that the Inspector General made. I concur completely. His observation that we have one standard of safety, and we do, in fact, have one standard of safety. What we are seeing, however, and this tragic accident has put a pretty bright light on the fact that we don't have an equivalent level of safety. We find that some of the carriers are doing a remarkably good job and should be commended for operating well above the bar, well above the minimums required. We know, for example, that one of our major carriers has it as a policy that anyone that provides service to them via a capacity purchase agreement or other commercial arrangement, they require them within a given period of time that they must have a FOQA program. They must have an ASAP program. They must have a mentoring program. So the purpose of us bringing these folks together next week is twofold. Number one, let's get down, sit in a room, and be very candid about what are those best practices. What are people doing that's above and beyond and superlative to what is required by the statutes and by the regulations. And let's learn what those best practices are. And then, secondarily, can we implement those quickly? And I intend to use the bully pulpit of this job to the extent that I can to bring people into. It has to be voluntary at this point. But my motivation here is by the time the NTSB finishes its good work, and it will be good work, we will learn from it, but that's 6 months from now. And if I acted the morning they gave me the recommendations, I'm 6 months from promulgating a regulation that I could put in force. That's a year from now, and that's too long. So what I'd like to do is take the knowledge that we have already learned from their preliminary investigation, take the knowledge from the industry. People want to do this right. This industry, I marvel at how well it does try to perform. And let's gather that best information. Let's provide mentoring programs. I can tell you from my own experience as a new pilot, my first trip, I never flew in an airplane where I didn't sit in the right seat with someone who had at least 10 years experience. That was a wonderful finishing touch to my primary education as a pilot. What I really learned was in line operation from senior captains, people who mentored me, and that's the way the process works. We have to question how much mentoring is going on, how much professional standards exist when a carrier expands very rapidly, and we can't critique them for it. It's a reality. You get a new contract, you buy 5 new airplanes, guess what? You hire 50 new pilots. How do we mentor them? Well, maybe we need to look to the major carriers and let them share that senior experience with these younger pilots, build that professionalism in them, and move forward. So that's our goal in the short term.
What concerns me, and I think concerns a lot of people in this room today, is voluntary versus mandatory. And I understand what you're talking about, rulemaking, but I believe that we need to look at some of these issues and mandate them through legislation. And I hope you will work with us on that. We intend to move forward to address some of these issues. I mentioned earlier in my opening statement that I intend to look at legislation. Mr. Micah indicated he'd like to do it in a bipartisan way, so we're going to work together, Mr. Petri and I, and members of this subcommittee. But my experience has been too often that when you leave it up to the airlines or when you leave it up to many agencies, that it doesn't get done if it's voluntary, if there are no penalties, if there is no mandate. So that is something that we'll be looking at, and we'll be looking to take your recommendations as well as Mr. Scovel and Mr. Rosenker. One final question.
Mr. Chairman, before you leave that point, may I interject a thought?
Please.
From that very chair, at that table, a dozen plus years ago, maybe 15, 18 years ago, Don Engen, then administrator of FAA, at a hearing that we conducted on closing of overwing exits on 747 aircraft, which was happening unknown to the administrator because of the then stovepiping of the regional offices of FAA. Don Engen, after hearing the testimony of flight attendants who had been engaged in rescue efforts on 747, where the only surviving exit was the overwing exit, said in his very opening remarks, Mr. Chairman, I have sent a message to the airlines and to Boeing now. I can't order them to do it. To do so will take rulemaking. It will take weeks, but I've sent a handwritten note to them right from this table to stop the process now. That's the kind of decisiveness. You mentioned that you're going to do this. You're not going to wait for rulemaking, and you said bully pulpit. You have more than a bully pulpit. You have power. And the airlines know they will go against you only at their peril. And we're here to support that initiative. We expect you to take that kind of leadership.
Well, I appreciate both your confidence and your support. Thank you, sir.
Final question, Mr. Babbitt. We have other members who want to ask questions, and I'll come back hopefully in a second round. You heard mention earlier that the NTSB recommendations, as they come to the FAA, there is a report that's supposed to come to the Congress. It's overdue. It was due in February of this year. We are now in June. I would ask you to go back and to make certain that that happens, to get it done and get that report to us. Finally, tell us, you had indicated that you are setting up a procedure to look at all of the NTSB recommendations and to respond to them. Tell us about the procedure that you intend to implement.
Yes, sir. First, at the risk of ratting out my boss, we have, in fact, the FAA has turned over, that's a DOT report, I believe, that you're referring to. We have turned over our portion of that in a timely fashion. So, but I will look into that and understand why. I think there's other modes that have to report into that. With regard to the NTSB recommendations, I have done a sort of a quick background research, but and I'll bring you up to date with that. But let me repeat what I put forward in my confirmation hearing and what I've announced in hearings in another body. And it's fairly straightforward, and I hope it's fairly simple and helpful. And that is, the NTSB does great work, and they investigate, and they do the full range of their investigation, and we should take those, and I intend to take those recommendations very seriously. And what I have said and will fulfill is we will act upon those recommendations in one of three ways. We will adopt them as written as soon as practically possible. Number one. There may be occasions where we have another regulation in place, or we might have some reason to suggest modification to it. We will adopt it as modified and notify you what modifications we made to the recommendation. And if for any reason we were not to adopt one of their suggestions, I will advise you why we didn't adopt that regulation and the rationale behind it, in concert and coordination with the NTSB. Let me just recap for you the results. We have indicated, I think, that there's over 450 recommendations. That sounds like an astounding number. It doesn't sound quite so astounding when you realize that we have adopted almost 5,000 of the ones they have recommended. And of those 437, a number of them are general aviation. But when we get all through boiling it down, many of them are in regulatory format now. They're working their way through the process of NPRMs. A number of them we have gone back to the NTSB and working in coordination. And I would note for the record that in my first week and before this hearing was even scheduled, I reached out to both of these gentlemen to better coordinate and ask for meetings that we would, it's my goal to work closely with them. They're valuable sources of information, as well as the subcommittee's staff and team. So I'm looking for input from all sources. But when we get all through boiling this down, there's about 130 left. And again, I want to know, why didn't we adopt them? And I will give you a rationale why we did not.
The Chair thanks you and now recognizes the ranking member of the subcommittee, Mr. Petri.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And as you consider all these suggestions, and I assume some are from the top down and some are from the bottom up and some from each side probably, I wonder if I could just it would help me to understand how you go through the process a little bit, if I could extract from a letter of a constituent and ask you to respond, anyone on the panel would care to this particular constituent's suggestions for some changes. I'm a captain based at Reagan National in Washington, D.C., but the person lives in Wisconsin. I fly a 50-passenger regional jet. I'm a 30-year-old pilot, husband and father of one. I am a professionally experienced pilot intent on spending my career flying airplanes. I have a few concerns about the FAA regulations governing rest and duty time for airline pilots, specifically regional airline pilots. I have some suggestions for you. Duty time needs to change from 16 hours for a regional airline pilot to 12 hours. This change would force the airlines to schedule pilots to fly during either the morning or evening. This will help combat fatigue, which I experience every week. I work out at my hotels, and I pay $2,700 a year for a crash pad in Crystal City to ensure proper rest for myself. Even with all my precautions, I cannot keep up with the continually degrading schedules. When you are in the airplane for 14 hours a day, you can't help but get tired toward the end of the day. The 30 hours in 7 days need to change to 30 hours in 10 days. During the past 11 days, I spent one night at home and flew 34 hours. This may not seem like a lot of flying, but flying on the East Coast is very demanding. I have a responsibility to ensure safe travel of 50 people into the world's busiest airports. I can't see myself being able to do this job for very long given my current workload. Regional airline pilots should be restricted to 6 legs of flying a day. Present, we are limited to 8 hours scheduled flying, but we are not limited to how many times we fly. Limiting the number of legs a day will increase safety, decrease fatigue and stress. It's very hard to focus after 6 legs of flying in a day. I also wish we could force airlines to build commutable schedules, but that's a pipe dream. Do you have any reaction to his 2 suggestions about taking into consideration legs as well as hours and limiting the time to 12 instead of 16 hours?
I'll start off to try and address some of the points made. One of the things that I consider a top priority, having sat here and testified before the good Chairman Overstar a number of years ago on this very issue, one of the priorities that I have is to address the flight time, duty time issue. I think one of the difficulties that your constituent has pointed out is the fact that he's selected an arbitrary number. I think one of the things that we're learning it from NTSB, we're learning it from the Inspector General, we're learning it from NASA. We have science today to help us with flight time, duty time calculations. And I think we need to really look at this in the light of science. There's a big difference between an arbitrary 12 or 14 or whatever the number is, 16 hours. Let's use 14. If you and I went to work together at 7 o'clock in the morning, we'd be tired at 9 o'clock tonight, but we'd be okay. But if we went to work at 9 o'clock tonight, at 11 o'clock tomorrow morning, I wouldn't even want to drive in a car with you, much less fly in an airplane. So there's a big difference between what 12 or what 14 hours are we measuring. There's also a difference when pilots fly. We have rules where you can go beyond with supplemental crews, long-haul flights. And your constituent is exactly correct, and I concur with the idea that multiple landings is one thing to fly 1 8-hour leg from here to Paris. It's another thing to fly 7 hours and make 14 stops and never leave the state of Florida, and I have done that. So I know the difference in measuring arbitrary numbers, and I think as much as I respect what he's trying to achieve, I think we really should bring science in, use the best knowledge, and create rules that keep people from being fatigued. The FAA did, I think, a very credible job of trying to address this by having a fatigue seminar, and I think we should go the next step now. Let's take what we've learned in those seminars and let's apply it to proper regulations that'll help people, help them aware or become aware of when they are fatigued. That's another leg to it. 30 and 7 versus 30 and 10, I put it in the same box. 130 hours, that's Narita, Detroit, Narita. Those are 2 long legs, 2 landings. That's not the same as 30 hours in the Northeast shooting approaches to 200 feet in the snow. So again, we need to measure what we're doing and apply the proper parameters for the proper conditions. 6-leg limit, I think when we looked at flight time, duty time a number of years ago, that was absolutely one of the considerations where you could say, hey, it's okay to fly 10 hours a day with 1 leg. But if you begin to have multiple legs, maybe you then reduce the cap, and I think he's probably on target there. I'm just not sure what the limit should be at this point.
If I could add to Administrator Babbitt's position, he is exactly on target. We believe that fatigue is probably one of the most insidious conditions that people, many people, never recognize they are coming down with it. And that's the frightening aspect. It will show up, and then the fatigue sets in. They make poor judgments, and many times result in accidents. Back in '95, I believe the FAA attempted to make some changes through an NPRM. It never came to publication. It never came to fulfillment. The reality of life is it's been about 50 years since the hours of service has truly been examined. This industry has changed significantly in 50 years. The kinds of aircraft we fly, the kinds of training we get, the kinds of destinations we go to. They're different than they were 50 years ago. So it is time to make changes, and I look forward to working closely with the administrator. I applaud him on his work that's going to come next week, his quick action to bring in the industry, to bring that level up one more time. We continue to talk about it, and we must never, ever begin to segregate regionals from majors. It is a 121 industry that we are dealing with. We don't make recommendations to segments of the industry in our 121. Virtually all of our recommendations go to the industry as a whole. And we have to be making sure that we continually raise that standard for all of our industry to maintain the safest level we possibly can find. We have a safe industry today, and our objective is to make it even safer.
Chair, thanks you, Mr. Petri, and I'll recognize as the gentleman from Oregon, Mr. DeFazio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Administrator Babbitt, ever hear the term pilot pushing?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Do you recall or have you reviewed your 92 testimony regarding intimidation, punitive firing, disciplinary action by airlines when pilots reported fatigue?
I haven't reviewed my testimony, but I have a recollection of it, sir.
You have the recollection. You say you could bring in an amazing parade of people to testify that this went on in the industry.
Yes, sir.
But then you said here people want to do the right thing. I guess I have trouble reconciling pilot pushing, intimidation, punitive firing, discipline for pilots who are trying to follow the law and report themselves fatigued, and people want to do the right thing. I would say there are some in the industry who want to do the right thing. And our current rules, unfortunately, go to the lowest common denominator. Good old Frank Lorenzo dragged down a lot of the industry. You can't compete with people like that because they are at the bottom of the barrel. We need to have a uniform higher standard. I just can't believe we still have a standard of 250 hours minimum qualification for a first officer when a nail technician takes 600 hours in Oregon. Now, I mean, there's something wrong there. And if the FAA said, no, we're going to make it 750 or whatever would be appropriate, then people can still operate above that, and there would be some who would do that or who are more attractive employers or who pay better. But at least you wouldn't have the bottom of the barrel operators taking the people with 250 hours, and paying them, just absurdly low wages, so bad that they have to live with their mother, and then stick them up there in difficult conditions. I mean, can't we consider those sorts of things? I didn't see it in the list of the NTSB's recommendations. I don't know if it has been recommended to establish a higher initial bar.
Let me, if I may, address two issues. You raised first the pushing, and I would say and would stand by that the majority, and I think you're right, some. We have a number of carriers, and the problem is the knowledge level of some of the new pilots. I can tell you right now, a senior pilot at a major carrier, if he was fatigued, he would simply say to the company, listen, we've been on duty 10 hours, it's the wrong 10, we're all tired, we're going to the hotel, and nobody would blink. But you take a pilot who's been 3 months with a brand new carrier, not even covered by any representation, has no whistleblower.
That's the key. That's one of the keys which you pointed to in 92, if they don't have protection.
That's correct. And they have no whistleblower protection. So they're not about, they worked very hard to get this job. And they're not about to say, oh, gee, I'm a little tired today, I'm not going to fly. They may be exhausted, but they're reluctant. And that's an area that we all have to focus on. Second, the quality and the 250 hours, if I could, let me just politely suggest that there may be a difference. 250 hours in the airplane has also been matched by hundreds of hours of ground school training, simulators, all of that type of stuff. We're not talking about 8 hours in a classroom.
No, but some, and we had Ms. Slaughter referenced one particular outfit that does training in Florida and pushes people through pretty quickly. The quality of that time varies tremendously. And it just seems to me that, and some of the regional airlines require considerably more than 250 hours for, hiring, no matter how much ground school people have had. And I'm just suggesting that that is something additionally that needs to be reviewed. Did NTSB have any?
Mr. DeFazio, I think you are making an excellent point. We don't know yet if 250 hours is the appropriate number. It may well be that something will come from the Colgan accident which may talk about a reexamination of minimum requirements. At this point, we're not on the record. We have not made any recommendations to that point. So another issue that I'd like to bring up is hours don't always make a proficient pilot.
Absolutely.
Many times at the board, we have investigated terrible accidents that have been made by high-hour pilots, 12, 15,000, where the pilot has just made an incredibly amateurish mistake for a host of reasons. So we don't want to equate hours with high levels of proficiency and skills. We would always want to take a look at the programs they are going through, the continual proficiency checks that they must pass before we begin to say that these people are highly qualified and to let them do what they need to do.
All right. Well, I appreciate that. You did point out in your testimony on the other subject of fatigue that Colgan had changed their handbook to say, previous edition said flight crew members should not attempt to commute to their base on the same day they're scheduled to work, but their current edition at the time of this accident said a commuting pilot is expected to report for duty in a timely manner. And I would note that the first officer took the red eye from Seattle. I have taken that flight. By 6 or 7 o'clock the next night, I'm not at my best just making judgments about voting or editing things in the office or something else, let alone flying a plane in icing conditions. And I'd say it's a fairly similar circumstance, and I've done a lot of this. And I'm just trying to point out that some operators are going to take the flexibility that they're given and use it to dive for the bottom. Then they can offer a lower cost product, and the other people who are trying to do a better job and say, you should never, ever take the red eye, come here and fly the same day, spend the day in the crew lounge and fly the same day. Some other operator is doing that, probably is going to have to pay them more than $23,000 a year, so they don't have to live with their mother in Seattle and fly across the country. I mean, I'm trying to point out that we need to establish, I think it's the FAA's duty to establish a higher bar, and then no one's at a competitive disadvantage. And I don't think you'll find a single person who would be unwilling to pay an extra $2 or $5 for a ticket because we raised the bar and Colgan Air isn't out there dragging everybody down, or someone else like them, not to just pick on them, our good old Frank Lorenzo and everybody else who's tried to do this in the industry. That's all. Thank you, Mr.
Chair. Thanks, the gentleman, and now recognizes the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Micah.
Well, welcome, Mr. Babbitt. I'm so pleased that we do have a confirmed administrator and one with your high credentials. I guess we're going to lose Mr. Rosenker as the chair, so compliment you on the great job you've done at NTSB and will continue to do, but we appreciate your past service and your beginning service, Mr. Babbitt. A question for both of you. Well, actually, we'll include our representative IG panelist. Are our regional airlines safe, Mr. Babbitt?
Yes, they are.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Rosenker?
I would agree with the administrator. They are, sir.
Thank you. Mr. Scovel?
Mr. Micah, I have no evidence that they're unsafe.
Thank you. Well, I think that's important. I guess 25% of the passengers, or flights, not passengers, are on regional airlines. We need to reassure the public. And it's my understanding you testified at the beginning, I heard your remarks, Mr. Babbitt, that we have the same standards in place for both our large commercial aircraft as also for our regional carriers. Is that correct?
Yes, sir. They all operate under Part 121, and they meet those standards. The point I was making was, some of them higher.
I think we have to reassure the public, and of course, as I point out to folks that today more than 100 people will die in automobile accidents, and every day, 365 days a year. So while we've had some tragedies, we have an incredible record with our large commercial aircraft domestically. And I may have a quick question about the problem that we may have with Airbus in a second. But Mr. Rosenker, you recommended, or NTSB recommended, I think more than 3 years ago, I've got a copy of the recommendation, that we actually open up some of the records beyond 5 years of the performance. I was shocked to hear that, again, that some of the mechanism that I thought Mr. DeFazio and I put in place some years ago to continue to call those recommendations to the attention of both Department of Transportation, FAA, and also Congress, because ultimately we're responsible if an agency isn't acting. Do I need to change what we put in law? What's the problem with not getting your recommendations acted upon, Mr. Rosenker?
Well, sir, I wish I had a silver bullet to be able to tell you if we did this, all of the NTSB recommendations would be enacted.
But I have your recommendation here. I have the number of flights that commuter flights that we've lost with fatalities. Obviously, there's some disconnect, because I said earlier I have commuter unfortunate number of fatal crashes. You have a recommendation for the 6 recommendations related to pilot performance. And I can't get a simple recommendation from you into a rule or a law.
I have, if we're talking about some open recs that we have related to the Colgan Buffalo accident, I can share with you approximately where we are. The stick pusher recommendation and the upset training is going to be handled and implemented when the NPRM is fully implemented. It is being covered by the January NPRM, and I want.
But what about the records recommendation?
Oh, we're talking about the records.
Yes.
That's been on our
recommendation
list for a number of years.
2005.
Yes, sir. And
but we still don't have implementation. Is there? What's the implement?
Well, there are some regulatory concerns, and there has to be.
And there's also a privacy concern, I know, too, as far as pilot certification issues. But I think, again, when we're putting someone behind the yoke or in control of an aircraft, the airlines should be able to access, and the representative from New York, Slaughter, went beyond what I had recommended, that this should be, I guess, online or public information. But at least the person hiring should have access to information about performance and their ability to pass certification tests.
We agree with you, Mr. Micah. And as I say, we put this forth in 2005. An excellent first step is what the Congress did in 96. It began the Pilot's Record Act. The continuation, where we find we can get additional information, which is being stored at the FAA, that information is extremely valuable. This deals with pass-fail, the kinds of certifications that the candidate has. This would be an extremely valuable bit of information when an airline is attempting to evaluate and decide which one of the candidates they should hire. Should they take one who has had 5 failures, or should they take one who seems to be extremely proficient in going through their instruction programs? So we have made that recommendation. In reality, an airline can get the material by having the pilot sign a waiver, but it should be a requirement. It should be made significantly easier.
But it hasn't been implemented, Mr. Babbitt.
If I may, a little background. I'm familiar with the Pilot Record Act, and that act was born from the lack of information that one carrier hired a pilot not knowing that he had multiple failures in training at another carrier. And so the focus was on the contemporary pilot's activities, and they said, you know what, we should know what he did at the last carrier. I think what this accident has shined some fairly bright light on is excluded in that, as it wasn't a subject of the discussion at the time, was the fact that they also, the FAA maintains another database. We maintain all the records of every rating, all the writtens and so forth. Those too are maintained. But the Pilot Record Act, my suggestion would be that we probably need to modify that rule statutorily so that you get both. There are privacy concerns that come into that issue, and I think we do need to look at that. The FAA, of course, has the oversight authority. Once you make that regulation change, then it is the obligation of the FAA to ensure that those regulations are being complied with. But the oversight was, we didn't ask for enough when we wrote the rule.
Chair thanks the ranking member and now recognizes the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Buccieri.
Thank you, Mr. Costello, and thank you to the panel coming here today. It's becoming clear that the 50 deaths that occurred that night in February were not only tragic, but completely avoidable. And I want to focus on 3 things. Mr. Chairman, I request that the letter that I submitted to Colgan Air and their response and my testimony and my remarks be submitted to the record. 3 things I want to focus on. With 15 years of training with the United States Air Force and thousands of hours as a C-130 pilot, I am baffled by the response, and I'm baffled by the lack of attentiveness to the recommendations that have been made from the NTSB to the FAA. Number 1, when I buy a ticket from an airline, I buy a ticket from Continental, Delta, whomever, I'm buying a ticket with them because I like their training records, their statistics, and I like and respect the fact that they have certain level of expectations with respect to their pilots. Yet the code share agreements that we have right now in practice are for purely marketing reasons, and the FAA even acknowledges in its own admission that it has nothing to do with safety. In fact, they said the code share agreements reported that safety was not treated as a major factor in the department's code share approval process, and the FAA did not take an active role in the approval or oversight of these agreements. That's a shame, and it's tragic. Number 2, the regional airlines do not have the same standards as the major airlines. The FAA likes to talk about we train like we fly and we fly like we train. But yet when I dug down and found the root of why this aircraft commander, this captain, did not apply the appropriate procedures to recover from this stall, it was a full stall, an approach to a stall and a full stall, he did not apply the appropriate procedures. And when I wrote to Colgan Air, they suggested that every pilot receives complete ground training on the Q400 stall system, which includes a stick shaker, stick pusher. The training includes the recognition and recovery from near stall, an indication of a stall, the stick shaker for the push-off. Yet, the NTSB said when they interviewed check pilots, interviewed the demonstration or instruction of the aircraft pusher system is not part of the training syllabus for initial or recurrent training by Colgan. These pilots did not know how to recover from a full stall. Completely avoidable. And in fact, the NTSB said that in their training requirements, that the FAA should have upset recovery training aids and the NTSB advised that training and stall recovery should go beyond the approach to a stall to include training recovery from a full stall condition. In addition to the cases with the flight data are available, weather, flight tests, incidents, that these data should be used to model stall behavior and facilitate training beyond the initial stall warning. Yet since 1974, the FAA has not enacted stall recovery, stall training, and stall recovery requirements for a series of accidents that happened back in the 1970s. Unacceptable. As a military pilot, we would not be able to fly. We would not be able to fly if we were not allowed to recover from, or not able to recover from a full stall, approach to a stall, and an unusual attitude recovery. And in fact, the major airlines, I went to reserve duty this weekend, and I asked a couple of my buddies who fly for the major airlines, and they suggested, oh, we go into all kinds of unusual attitudes, unusual recoveries, full stall recognitions, and they have to recognize the performance and structural integrity of their aircrafts when they recover from those procedures. Yet these have not been enacted. The third item, why are we permitting our pilots in commercial aviation to fly into severe icing? As an airlift pilot in the United States Air Force, the United States Air Force does not allow me to fly into severe icing. Yet this crew flew into what is arguably considered severe icing, freezing drizzle, freezing rain. Yet the training manual says that do not, for Colgan Air, suggests, and this is from the NTSB Safety Bureau report, do not attempt a takeoff or make an approach to land in freezing rain, sleet, or drizzle, wet snow conditions that are beyond the performance limits of the aircraft. So it is clear that as long as the performance aircraft or performance indicators of what they do when they crunch their numbers in their charts before they land based on their weight and atmospheric conditions, they may make a mistake, they may not, but yet they are permitted to fly into freezing rain and severe icing. That's unacceptable. I think that this panel not only has an obligation but a duty to force the FAA to adhere to every one of the recommendations that they made. In particular, for the record, I want to cite Alpha-96-120, the advisory of the NTSB that talks about unusual attitudes and recoveries with respect to this still being an open and unacceptable response by the FAA as it pertains to Part 121. I hope we get down to the brass knuckles with respect to changing this, because we have families that are sitting over there right now, grieving the loss of their loved one because we had inadequate training. Now, knowing that Colgan Air pilots were not able or trained to recover from a complete stall in an unusual attitude, I ask you, Mr. Rosenker, would you fly on one of these regional airlines if you knew the pilot was not able to recover from a full stall or not trained to recover from a full stall?
In fairness, Congressman, if I knew that, I wouldn't.
To Mr. Babbitt, would you fly on a regional airline if you knew that the pilots were not adequately trained to recover from a full stall?
I not only wouldn't fly on it, I would ground it.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think this has brought to light some very serious issues that we need to bring to the attention of not only this committee, but to the entire public who flies on these regional airlines. Thank you.
I thank the gentleman for his thoughtful comments and questions, and look forward to working with you as well as we go forward with legislation to address some of these issues.
Mr. Chairman, may I just observe what a storehouse of knowledge we've just heard from the gentleman from Ohio and his experience in military aircraft and icing, and it was a textbook case. Thank you for your contribution. It's invaluable.
Chair now recognizes the gentlelady from West Virginia, Ms. Capito.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ranking Member Petri for holding this very important hearing. I would like to ask, I will be submitting my opening statement for the record, but I do want to thank, as we have, several of us have met several of the families who are affected by this deep tragedy, and I want to thank them for their courage, for their knowledge, and for them helping to enlighten a lot of us, and I think bringing forth many issues today. My question is kind of bouncing a little bit off of what my colleague from Ohio was talking about. Originally, when the original accident, this accident occurred, it was referred to as the Continental connection flight. But very quickly it became Colgan Air. And in the NTSB report, I think it is referred almost unanimously or always as Colgan Air, but maybe began as Continental. And my guess is, and many of us have said this, is that the passengers who buy the tickets think they're buying Continental. I buy U.S. Air and fly Colgan Air every week. And I think that what is the responsibility or the relationship between the major carrier, contract carrier, when it comes to safety? Is it totally separate? Because I'm kind of hearing conflicting opinions here. You're saying it's the same safety standard, but then Mr. Rosenker wanted to reinforce that we must keep these on the same level, which tells me there's a belief that they're not. So could you talk about that relationship a little bit? Sure. Whoever wants to take it.
Both the carriers in this case were operating under Part 121 of the federal regulations. However, there may have been, and we are certainly going to await both some findings from the NTSB, and the Inspector General has been directed to look into aircraft training, or airline training. So we're going to look to both of those. We're also not going to just simply wait. We are bringing in these folks that represent major carriers, regional carriers, and the pilots and unions involved in these to better understand what are the gaps. Are there gaps, in fact, between what's going on at these various carriers? And so that's what we want to look into. The standards are there. They're embodied in Part 121, and the regulations that guide both of these carriers are clear. But what we have seen and I've been referring to here, we're finding that some people have raised the bar considerably. And if that's the case, then we want to, we now have an expectation that why isn't everyone raising that bar?
Just in terms of the resources that are available for safety training, whether it's a regional, whether it's a major, I'm assuming the major has more resources available for training. Is that a reasonable assumption?
Well, I think what you see at major carriers, the tenure and longevity of the people that head the safety training departments, their experience over the years has allowed them to build on a base that is more robust. If a carrier is newer, comes into being, they get certified, they operate legally, but they don't have the experience. There are no 25-year pilots at some of these carriers. And what we're looking to do when we bring everybody together is there a way to cross-pollinate, for lack of a better term? Can't we take that experience and lessons learned in other cases and let them use it, give them the benefit of that knowledge and expose them to it? That's our goal now. And then we will have optimally 6 months to a year of experience of seeing this, and at that time we fully expect to get some additional recommendations from the NTSB. We'll already have some operating experience with trying to do just those things. Should we, in fact, I indicated in earlier comments that we know full well that some of these carriers demand that their regional partners have some of these safety attributes that they have themselves.
I think people flying assume that that's what is actually occurring. And I think that is, one of the astounding things that we've discovered here today. So I didn't mean to interrupt you. I want to ask one other question because my time's getting short. When you have a mechanical failure on a plane or a mechanical issue with a plane, it's mandatory that it's upgraded, recalled, stopped. Thank goodness. But it's my understanding that if there are some pilots that need additional training, or they have had issues with falling short, we've already heard they failed some of the tests, that there's no mandatory requirement that they go back to remedial training. It's just suggested. If that's the case, we've got to change that. I think there's no less important whether the plane can fly or whether the pilot can fly under optimal conditions. And I don't know if you have a response to that. And Mr. Rosenker, I cut you off on the first question, so
I'll let the administrator answer that question, and then I'll follow up with what the original question was.
The modern training theory today, there's a number of elements involved in training. A pilot may take, and remember that these are probably the most tested people in the world. They take 2 physicals a year and three rides. One of them is a proficiency check. One of them is a check ride, and then they get a random line check periodically. So 3 times a year, their performance is observed. In the proficiency training, if a pilot, his training pilot said, look, you could do this particular element better, let's have a little more training for you tomorrow. That pilot can't fly. That pilot is now grounded.
Is that mandatory grounding?
Yes. Pilot has not passed his check ride. So he is grounded.
So the pilot that we've been talking about, if he didn't pass his check ride, he was unable to fly again until he passed the test?
That is correct. So we would go back and revisit that element, give them additional training to make them proficient. When that proficiency is demonstrated, then he passes the check ride and it is okay. It's just like fixing the part. You know, I remind people that this is a complex profession. I also remind people that, you know, Tiger Woods takes golf lessons every week. Pilots get training all the time. We learn things all the time. We have better techniques to teach them. We have better equipment to teach them in. The fidelity of a simulator today is vastly improved over, you know, that I've seen it grow over time. So as we learn these things, we apply them. Sometimes there's a gap. Sometimes it takes our good friends at the NTSB to point that gap out, that we say, well, wait a minute, we should change the regulation and take it up to the next level of safety.
If I could just follow up to Congresswoman's question about the relationship between the major and the regional. It defies logic, at least the way I look at it, that when you put a brand, when you put a logo, when you paint the aircraft with your colors, that all you would be interested in is the financial aspects of when the ticket money is being deposited in the bank. I believe we're going to be uncovering a good deal of information concerning relationships like this through our investigation. But what is important to note is that the minimum standards are there. Are the minimum standards adequate? Should we be raising those standards? And can we look at the best practices? And that's one of the things that I believe the administrator and the secretary, they are going to do beginning next week. And again, it's going to take time for us to finish this investigation. We look for it to be completed in about the first quarter. But we believe there will be a good number of recommendations coming from it that, if implemented by our colleagues at the FAA, will do a great deal to prevent this kind of accident from happening again.
Chair thanks the gentlelady and now recognizes the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. Lipinski.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ranking Member Petri, for holding today's hearing and your continued leadership in working to ensure safety and integrity of our nation's air transportation system. Administrator Babbitt, I want to welcome you and congratulate you. Looking forward to working with you here. While so far we have rightfully focused on pilot workforce issues, another possible issue in the Colgan Air tragedy may have been the weather. So I'd like to focus on a broader issue involving weather and air traffic. Specifically, I want to discuss the plan submitted by the National Weather Service to the FAA in December. This plan proposes closing the Center Weather Service units located within the 20 air route traffic control centers in the continental U.S. As you know, this plan was developed by the National Weather Service in response to the Bush administration's request to cut costs at FAA. And it calls for the National Weather Service to send the 20 FAA facilities forecast from 2 central units located in Maryland and in Kansas City. So I know I'm not alone in worrying that if this plan is implemented, air traffic controllers at the air route traffic control centers will no longer have the immediate expertise of on-site meteorologists to advise them on where to route aircraft experience difficulties when weather conditions play a critical role in that decision. As we've talked about, that certainly, we don't know if that had an impact here, but the weather certainly was an issue in this crash. So I think clearly we need to carefully evaluate this proposal. Now, I don't know, you probably haven't had time to consider the proposal in detail. You haven't been in this job for very long yet, but I know back in 1996, when you were head of the Airline Pilots Association, you strongly opposed eliminating or weakening the Center Weather Service units. I understand 13 years is a long time, and things do change. But I'd like to know what your thoughts are now that you can share on how this proposal will impact redundant safety systems, and how you plan to assess performance of the new centers. Because I have great concerns gleaned questions about how the proposed centralized forecasters can have intimate knowledge of local microclimates and air traffic patterns. But since we're running short on time here, I know, let me also throw this in there and then get your response. I think probably the most important question here is if you have any doubts about the performance of the proposed system, would you be willing to put on hold its development until those concerns can be addressed? Because I know that the leadership at the Department of Transportation has taken a closer look at the Bush administration plan to consolidate FAA engineering activities and was wondering if that was also a possibility if you did have concerns about this. So,
sure. I appreciate your recognition of my short tenure. I have, in fact, had a little bit of an understanding on this. Just a couple of quick observations. The local knowledge issue, these meteorologists providing information in the centers, or no matter where they are, they're looking at the weather all over the United States. Flights are going everywhere. They don't just stay in that area, number one. Number two, one of the restraints that we have today is most of these are manned for 16 hours a day. That leaves us a third of the day with no meteorologist, and what they do today is call into other areas. So while I completely respect the point you're making, and I certainly will look into it, my understanding was the idea that centralizing into a couple of locations for the purpose of having redundancy, if we had a communication failure or something like that, you'd always have the other center, but you'd also get a much more robust 24-hour-a-day availability for meteorology advice and forecasting and so forth. I would also note most of the major carriers today, while in the era a long time ago when I was hired, we did have meteorologists at every pilot domicile. When you met physically with the dispatcher, you met physically with the meteorologist before your flight. There was some resistance to it, but at the end of the day, they did, and I think today every major carrier has centralized meteorology. It's more efficient, it gives you redundancy, it gives you a broader depth. So that said, I will certainly look into if you've got additional information. I think the Department of Commerce actually has that as opposed to the DOT, but we do, it is again my understanding that the FAA buys those services from the Department of Commerce. So we'll certainly look into it and be respectful. If there's a better way, I'm all for it.
Well, I appreciate you keep a close eye on this and make sure that we are doing the right thing and are ensuring safety. Thank you.
Chair, thanks to the gentleman from Illinois. Let me inform everyone that we have 2 votes pending on the floor. We have about 5 more minutes left before we have to leave to vote. I will recognize the gentlelady from Ohio for questions, and then after her questions, we will recess for approximately 30 minutes for us to get the 2 votes out of the way, and we will reconvene the hearing at that point. Gentlelady from Ohio, Ms. Smith's recognized.
Thank you, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, because if I appear passionate with this issue, it is because in addition to losing Jonathan Perry from Loveland, Ohio, a community I grew up in and I still live in, the Walensky's, who lived on Long Street in New York, spent almost a decade in Loveland, went to the same church that I grew up in. And so this is really a very personal issue for me. And Mr. Babbitt, I want to ask you a question and then the panel one, and I'll try to be brief. Chairman, or Ranking Member Micah talked a little bit about the issue of privacy and also the issue of pilot training and access to that information. And it's my understanding that if a pilot fails a number of safety tests with one airline and then switches to another airline, the new employer does not necessarily know that the pilot has failed those tests and that there's no uniform database that allows airlines to review the past performance of pilots on all safety tests. And you know, I'm wondering, how do we make this safer? Would it be acceptable and useful and not violate the 1974 right of privacy policy that you alluded to on page 7 of your testimony? Would it be acceptable if we create a safe and secure private database, not open to the public, but open to the airline industry, so that when one pilot crosses to another industry, that they can access that data and see what tests they have passed, what tests they have failed, and not just put an arbitrary date of 5 years on them, but their lifetime scoring, so that the airlines can adequately review their performance tests.
Well, I think your point is a good one. They do, in fact, when a pilot applies at another carrier, they can get his training records from the carrier.
Is it mandatory, or it's always accessible?
No, they have to. But that's only their training records from the previous carrier. That's my understanding. Now, what the bright light is being put on here is there's no requirement. There is a suggestion in an advisory circular from the FAA that you should ask the pilot, and I have asked, based on what I have just learned in the last week from the NTSB investigation, I've asked counsel at the FAA, would it be discriminatory? One of my concerns was, you're trying to hire me as a pilot, and you ask me, may I access your database records at the FAA? And I say no. Is that discriminatory for you not to hire me? It would certainly raise my eyebrows if I were you and I refused to give you access to my records. I would want to know why. And so I agree that we perhaps need to find a vehicle. A, is it legal? And B, do we have to change a statutory requirement to get to those, provided the adequate protections for personal information.
Thank you. And this is to anyone on the panel that can answer this. There's been some talk about the salaries, and some of these salaries are at $23,000. Who sets the salaries for these pilots? Is it negotiated by a union? Is it the airline industry? How does this pay grade occur? Do you have that level of expertise, or do we wait for the next panel?
I have a little background in that area.
That's why I kind of looked at you.
I sensed that. The first year of employment is typically set by the carrier. It's not negotiable. The employee is a pilot. He or she is at will. They have no protection. They typically are not even eligible to belong to a union or be represented. After that, usually 1 year, 18 months into their employment, somewhere in that range, then they become covered by a collectively bargained agreement.
Thank you.
Chair thanks the gentlelady and announces that we will recess until approximately 12:30. And let me thank the members of this panel for being here this morning to offer their thoughtful testimony. I have other questions that I will submit to you in writing and ask that you respond. We look forward to working with you on this critical issue as we move forward with legislation. So we thank you for testifying. This panel is dismissed. We would ask that the second panel be at the witness table at approximately 12:30. Thank you.